So I've had a bunch of questions about a statement I made in passing on a podcast recently about how I don't really agree with Hume's law. And I've had a bunch of people asking me why that is the case and could I explain it. So for anyone who doesn't know, David Hume was an 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher who coined a term has become famously known as Hume's law or Hume's guillotine, which is you can't derive an ought from an is, as in simply because something is a fact does not mean we ought to do something about it. The sky is blue. Are we obligated to do something about that? The answer is no. This is a very useful intellectual tool for separating factual statements from moral statements, because one of the things you might notice in your own life is that people are very, very, very quick to combine moral and factual statements into the same category and act as if the way that people wish things should be is the way that things actually are. And Hume was pointing out that this just wasn't the case. It is useful because if we're not precise in our thinking, we could end up with some quite terrible results. Sloppy thinking can lead to bad outcomes, especially as ought is quite a soft word. You ought to do this, you ought to do that. But it leads on to stronger imperatives such as should, shall, and must, which all grow out of this same view. And this is why we should be precise in the way we think about these things. And obviously these words are used often in non-moral contexts, but Hume is specifically talking about the moral ones. But to explain why I think Hume is wrong here comes from a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong by John Mackey, an Australian 20th century philosopher. And he uses the example of institutions, not necessarily formal institutions, a building you can visit, a person you can speak to, but institutions that are, say, we could just call social institutions. And these can be rituals that we have, these can be games that we play, things like this. In fact, a really good example of this is the game of chess. I could play a game of chess with someone who I don't even share a language with, because the rules of chess are so ubiquitous, it's such an old game, and everyone knows how it's supposed to be played, that the rules of the institution are present in people's understanding when we both sit down at the chessboard, even if I can't even say hello to the guy. When he makes his first move, I know that he'll move a rook forward, a pawn forward two squares, and I'll know that he understands the rules of chess, and we will automatically fall into playing it as we understand it. And so this is what can be described as an institution. It's got established rules, it's got established norms and customs and behaviors surrounding it that are well known. And so from the institution of chess, from the is that is the institution of chess, and our shared understanding of what a game of chess is, we actually can derive a whole bunch of oughts or shoulds or musts that we could express as imperatives if the context warranted it. Ought just merely being a reason that an agent should do something, can do something. In fact, no, should do something is more applicable in whichever political context, particular context. So, I mean, I could say something like, you must not move your rook diagonally, the rook being the castle piece that only moves up and down or left and right. But maybe I could say you should move your queen to check the king, or you can't move your knight in a straight line, or whatever it is, because the rules are the rules, and drawing from a shared understanding and endorsement of the rules of chess, which I assume that we're endorsing implicitly because we sit down to play a game of chess, so I can actually ascribe a kind of authority to myself to make these imperative statements. And it's not just in non-moral contexts that we have these institutions. The example that John Mackey gives is a really, really good one. I found it very, very persuasive. Moral institutions like this also exist, such as the institution of making a promise. This is not something that you can point to. It's not something that's been incorporated anywhere, but everyone everywhere accepts that there is an institution called a promise. And so if I promised to do something for you, you would have a justified expectation of me to fulfill that promise later down the line. So, for example, if I promise to pay John £5, and I've made this promise to pay £5, therefore, we can say that I have placed myself under an obligation to pay £5, and since it is the case that I am now under this obligation, I ought to pay John £5. If I'd previously borrowed £5 from John, we can quite securely say that this is now a moral imperative, as now I actually have a debt to him that I previously borrowed. And so any reasonable observer understanding this situation could just quite simply say to me that there is an ought from the establishment of the is that I owe John £5, that I ought to pay him that £5 back. And this person could have absolutely no relation to me or John or anything else. They would simply be speaking from either within the institution of promising, as in they endorse promising, and they think that people should, if they do promise, they should follow through with these promises, or even a neutral observer, or maybe a hostile observer, who doesn't personally agree with the institution of promising, but from within the context of what has been laid out can see that logically, yes, I do have an obligation to do this, and therefore I ought to follow through on it. And so these are what we could describe as objective or categoric. It doesn't require necessarily the people who are involved, the subjective interface from the people who are involved, to be something that can be established from the outside. And so we get more force when we speak from within the institution. If you're someone who is concerned that someone is breaking a promise because it's wrong to break a promise in principle, then it's very persuasive, and it is a way of shaming someone if they're failing to live up to their promise. And what these are sort of hypothetical imperatives. These are things that exist because of the institutions. They're drawn from the institutions. They aren't merely abstract categorical imperatives that exist prior to any kind of interaction with the real world. They are a part of the real world. But it seems that at least in one sense, Hume is wrong. You can actually derive an ought from an is, as I think I've demonstrated, and Mackie had demonstrated, really. And the thing is, if he's not wrong, where do we derive our oughts from? Why should anyone do anything? Why is the imperative that is being produced for us and pronounced onto us legitimate?